In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head.
Tell me, is it going to be okay?
He was pronounced dead at the scene.
My husband, can you tell me anything?
Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
Could have a seat right here, please?
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's house,
Get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am.
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hands, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something.
What'd you hear?
Stan picked up his gun, and the two went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him.
Oh my God, what happened?
She dialed
What happened,
911.
honey? Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, It irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is maybe...
I got some lady kept her in.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. She calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow. And possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Spear needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Spear spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case.
Are you going to wait there for us?
Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Spear's theory, but even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos.
Over the right side.
He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. she was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over and take some pictures of that?
Definitely a lot of evidence. But the guy from the gas tankers.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
I made some chocolate chip cookies for dessert.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions.
Taking a sample.
It revealed that Plant suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Unsure of.
Well, sure. Go
The
ahead.
beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz.
Throw that over the back of the couch.
It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage,
Before he left.
her financial situation,
So now your husband.
any enemies her husband may have had.
Employed at where?
Right before
Her
he left.
answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation.
I guess.
Okay.
It began to look as though Plantz may have been the victim of a random act of violence.
So
Gibson persisted in the investigation.
Of his relatives.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plantz's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plantz was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plantz? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimball. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimball was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plantz to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plantz planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug.
Check the underside of the rug.
It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below.
And then
They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled blood stains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plantz's home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimball's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek had swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plantz's home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police.
Carpet in. We're going to get the washcloth and jeans.
There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plantz. Only then would Bryson and McKimball's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
But some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans. Then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human anti-serum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plantz's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plantz's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimble, the murder occurred at Plantz's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plantz. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plantz's home, just as Bryson and McKimble had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plantz knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimble. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plantz's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plantz. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made two purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plantz had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plantz came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimble, were already there,
Get some scrambled eggs, okay?
waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the two men put the victim's body into his truck, drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The three conspired to kill Mr. Plantz for the insurance money. McKimble did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other two were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plantz and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimble received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You make a right. Okay. So you go left.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the Woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link. The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
More or less.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his 2 older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parents' death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crutzley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. 2 former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hommick, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hommick had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hommick had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, "What are you going to do if he comes around?" And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hommick revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hommick in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hommick could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hommick, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hommick was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hommick's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hommick's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hommicks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hommick's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hommick's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. Investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hommick to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hommick was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hommick's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hommick wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hommick from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stri pattern.
What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stri patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hommick to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hommicks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hammock's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit.
Sorry.
That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neil and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neil and Stewart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neil and Stewart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hammock, life without parole, and Steve Hammock, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale.
Around the world, a jigsaw puzzle of life and death lies in pieces. It is a story written in the blood of young people defending a country, a cause, an ideal. Some lived to return safely home, and some did not. Others disappeared. On a brisk autumn morning in upstate New York, the earth yields the victims of a savage world war waged more than 200 years ago. Half a world away, dense jungle guards secrets of soldiers gone but not forgotten. Today, a new breed of forensic detectives pieces together their terrible final hours in ways never before possible. How these people lived and died is written in their bones. After long years of lying silent, they begin to tell these soldiers' stories. As the ancients have said, the war is not over as long as the last slain soldier remains unburied. Although the unknown soldiers that lie here are in fact buried, no families were ever notified, no loved ones ever appeared by the grave. Who these people were, the pain and fear they suffered, how they died, all these mysteries are sealed forever beneath impenetrable marble slabs. Today, thanks to modern science, no one in the United States military need ever again become an unknown. During Operation Desert Storm in 1990, for the first time in history, the identity of two servicemen was established by extracting DNA from their shattered remains and matching it against the DNA of living relatives, a costly and difficult process. Now, to more easily trace the names of war casualties, blood is taken at recruitment to predetermine each person's DNA pattern, as unique as their fingerprints. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the blueprint of life. The chemical essence of genes, it exists in all cells of the body and carries the information for eye color, race, height, and other traits. Today, the technology to decipher DNA is so precise that recruits go off to war with a kind of genetic dog tag on file with the government. Hundreds of samples a year arrive at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology outside Washington, D.C.
How are you?
The laboratory, which is the largest of its type in the world, processes and stores the genetic material. A computer checks name and social security number and prints labels for each packet. Maintained under tight security, the data may not be released except by court order. More than 1 million samples are already placed in deep freeze, each representing a unique human being. Deputy Program Manager is James Canick.
For those who have ever visited Arlington or any military cemetery, probably one of the most moving things is to see a grave that doesn't have a name on it. And of course the inscription reads, "Here lies in honored glory an American service member known but to God." And we hope that in our little operation that we have here, that we will preclude that from ever happening again.
The first major war in which Americans fought and died was more than a decade before the War of Independence. The tranquil region, now known as Lake George, New York, was the scene of some of history's bloodiest fighting. In 1754, France and England clashed in a mighty struggle for control of North America. The brutal French and Indian War raged for 9 years and spread to every country where Britain and France had territorial interests. It has been called the first true World War. By 1763, with the French thoroughly defeated, the English ruled most of North America, including the 13 colonies. A strategic British outpost during the war was Fort William Henry. In the 1950s, the site was developed as a tourist attraction. Excavations of the old fort guided architects during reconstruction. While digging, scientists stumbled on an undisturbed burial ground. Today, a team of anthropologists and volunteers begin to piece together the story of how these soldiers lived and died. What they unearth is one of the most gruesome stories in the annals of war. Forensic anthropologist Mariah Liston first began working with the Fort William Henry burials in 1993. Her colleague, Brenda Baker, has worked with her since the beginning of the project. Liston and Baker know from patterns in the earth that they are guaranteed to find burials here.
This is the outline of one of the rectangular grave shafts. It extends from that corner to the head would be right here. We can tell it's a grave shaft because the disturbed soil from digging this hole has been thrown back in, and we get this mottled coloration that contrasts very strongly with the undisturbed sand in this area.
Over the course of 10 days, mounting excitement is tempered by the patience and precision for which every anthropologist is trained. As they carefully remove the earth within the grave shafts, the top of a skull finally emerges.
I think this is really one of the most exciting parts of this, because this is the first time this person has been seen since he was laid to rest, and you get an idea as you uncover his face of something about what he looked like and who he was.
Slowly, the extent of the find becomes evident. Remarkably, the skeleton seems intact.
When we first discover something new, some specific bit of information we haven't had before, it's exciting to have another piece of the picture and to know that we're filling out the puzzle a little bit more with each of these discoveries. So I often wonder what happened to their families. Did the families ever learn that these men had died or what they died from, and who they left behind? Many of them probably had wives and children in other places. They're all pretty young. They're as young as about 14 or 15 up to early 20s, most of them. There are a few that are a little bit older, but they're late teens and early 20s.
Before the skeleton is removed for preservation and study, Liston carefully documents its exact position. Even now, she begins to recognize the telltale signs of a vicious war etched in these bones.
It looks like this is one of the soldiers that has been doing a lot of really heavy labor. There's a lot of wear and tear on all of his joints.
The muscles in his back had torn from the soldier's bones under the constant stress of carrying heavy loads, and his ribs became fused to the vertebrae. He must have been in constant pain. If left exposed to the elements, the bones would deteriorate over time. Working well into the night, the team removes and labels each bone fragment to take to the lab.
I'm suspicious about this break in the back of the skull. It looks like something that may have happened while the bone was still fresh. It could easily be what killed him.
Take the hand of the left.
His face is going to come away.
As the fragile skull is pulled from the earth, the bones crumble. The skull apparently was crushed by the weight of the soil.
What a shame. It's this bad fracture here on the bottom, too, that comes across and gets, that as well.
But we may be able to see something a little bit more clearly when we get that all cleaned up.
Two small buttons are found with the skeleton. They appear to be military, but the team can't be sure until they have been removed. One was found in the pelvic cavity of the skeleton, and the other seems to be attached to an unidentified material.
And it looks like it's attached to either leather or it may very well be part of his skin. Copper often preserves organic tissue very well.
American militia fought alongside the British at Fort William Henry. Items like buttons and fabric may provide clues to rank and nationality. Painstaking work, cleaning, sorting, and documenting the remains will take more than a dozen people weeks to complete.
So this is probably where this other button, these two were down, they dropped down into the pelvic cavity, and this one was right up on top of the hip socket.
Some artifacts found with the bodies can be identified. Others remain a mystery. But many of the pieces in this detective story finally begin to take form. Far more than a pile of bones, a young soldier has emerged from the depths with a story he waited centuries to tell.
Yeah, you can see.
So those two.
2 weeks into the excavation, as winter closes in, one complete burial has been unearthed, and several others are still being excavated. The team's task now is to try to read the life history that is written in the bones.
The first thing that we can do is take a look at the skull and some of the features on the skull that indicate he's a male. If you look at the area over his eye orbits, you see that it's fairly well developed, and there are brow ridges essentially there, and that's a feature that you find in men. Women's foreheads tend to be a little bit higher. This one slopes back a bit, so that's an indication that this is a man. This is his jaw, his lower jaw, and you can see it's very large and robust, and his chin is extremely square, and this is another feature of a male.
Next, they must determine the person's age at death.
And if you look at the ends of his bones in his arms and legs, you can see that they're completely fused together. In younger individuals, you would see separate caps at the ends of the bones, and because those caps have fused on, we know that he's at least more than about 18 years old. We can see that his molars are all completely erupted here, including his wisdom tooth, and that usually erupts when you're about 18 to 21 years old. So again, another indicator that he's an adult male.
Many other questions remain. What was life at Fort William Henry like for this man? What was the condition of his health?
Most of the younger individuals had very severe arthritis. The only place where he has any significant arthritis is here in his right elbow. And this is the forearm. This is the bone where it hooks over your upper arm and allows you to move it back and forth like that. And if you compare the right elbow to the left elbow, you can see how much rougher this surface is here on the right. So this means he had a lot more action in his right arm, and because of the arthritis showing up just in his right elbow, it suggests that he's a right-handed man. We have another clue that he was right-handed because he's got wear on some of his teeth on his lower jaw, and you can see it's beveled right on these cusp surfaces here. So he's probably clenching a pipe over on the left side of his jaw. And that's what would have caused that kind of strange wear pattern on his lower teeth. And because he was clenching that on the left side of his jaw, he was probably right-handed. You would put the pipe in the left side of your mouth and use your left hand to take the pipe in and out.
The French and Indian War was fierce and long. Yet the soldiers' most constant enemy was not a bullet, but disease. Smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis ran rampant.
This group of skeletons is more sickly, in worse shape than anything I've ever worked with. I've looked at people as old as about 3,000 years old and more modern populations as well, and yet this is the most diseased group. They've got the most injuries. All the way around, there's more pathology here than anything.
Although more soldiers died from disease than war-related injuries, the battle picture that emerges becomes increasingly grim.
This soldier is an example of one that was shot. There's this depression that caused the bone to be crushed here, and another one at the top of the bone here. You can actually see the rounded depression of the musket ball. A lot of the soldiers that we found died from blows to the head. Here, something struck the soldier and punctured the bone, forcing fragments inside the skull and also fracturing it here down toward his eye and also running back toward the back of the skull.
Diaries reveal that as the French attacked Fort William Henry, the British simply surrendered, too sick with smallpox to fight back. Then, without warning, a group of Indians allied to the French attacked and slaughtered the ill and injured men. The event was central to the novel The Last of the Mohicans, long thought to be an exaggerated account. If anything, it turns out, it was an understatement.
In studying these skeletons, we have found extensive evidence of this massacre, documenting the fact that atrocities were committed. We know that there were mutilations and massacres on both sides. As part of this war, everyone was participating in this. This soldier was one that was beheaded, and we have the account of a French priest who saw the beginning of the massacre describing one of the native allies of the French coming out of the casemates, which were the hospitals at the fort, and carrying the head of his victim. Buried underneath the floor of the casemates, there was a mass grave of massacre victims, and this individual was indeed beheaded. In the neck bone that we have here, there are a number of cuts slicing across the bone, and a final one all the way through the bone here across the top. And so we're fairly certain that this is the individual that was beheaded that the priest saw.
The bones found inside the fort tell the story of the quick and ferocious attack.
As part of the massacre, part of the picture we've been able to reconstruct is that there were mutilations on the body, and this included genital mutilations. There are cuts on the front of the pelvis in the area of the genitals. In addition, we think some of the individuals were disemboweled, and there are cuts going all the way through the region of the stomach and abdomen into the backbone behind the abdomen. And we have here a number of cut marks and damage to the bone from that incident.
Today, forensic science reveals much about the hardships with which these young men lived, the horrors they suffered, and the savage ways in which many died. It can create a picture of a soldier who was over 18 and right-handed, a man who smoked a pipe, which he probably held in his left hand, a strong man who spent his days doing a lot of heavy lifting, his arms and legs free of arthritis, but his back in constant pain. His bones and those of his fallen comrades tell us much about what these soldiers' lives were like. But we can never know their names. Forever anonymous, they belong to the ages. In 1861, passions deeply felt over slavery brought the young American nation into a convulsive civil war. North against South, brother against brother, they fought for 4 bitter years. When the terrible trial by fire and sword came to an end, more than 600,000 boys and young men had died. The National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. was established in 1862 for record-keeping and follow-up care of the wounded. Here, Paul Sledzik has studied more than 2,000 bones of Civil War casualties. Although bone may appear rock solid, in actuality, it changes over one's lifetime, even over the course of a few days, in response to exercise, wear and tear, and disease.
Bone is like any other organ system in the body. It's constantly replenishing its cells and changing the cells within it. One of the changes that we can pick up in the bone that's interesting because it gets at what activities the soldiers were doing are these changes in the upper part of the humerus. This is the humerus, or the upper arm bone, from a Civil War soldier, and this defect here, this etched area in the bone, is indicative of heavy muscle activity of the upper arm, probably lifting the 15 to 20-pound rifles and firing them, digging with picks and axes.
The bones also tell of the savagery of battle. Although the wire was added later, this piece of shot was lodged in this man's leg for perhaps 2 months before he died.
These 3 cranial sections show very well how bone responds following trauma. This is a skull section, an entrance wound going to the inner part of the skull. And if we look around the fracture margin, there's no bony growth, and we know this man died as a result of this injury. This man lived for a month with this cranial injury. You can see there's some discoloration around the corners of the fracture margin here. If we look on the interior part of the skull, you also have some deposition of new bones called periosteal reaction. You can see some of the gray appearance here. This is new bone that's being laid down during the healing and/or infection process. And then if we advance the time even further and go to a similar injury in the cranium, this man lived for 10 years with this injury, a shot fracture injury. You can see there's been very good healing occurring around the site.
Changes in the bones show the effects of one of the soldier's deadliest enemies, infection. This is the upper leg bone of Private Julius Fabre, who was wounded at Deep Bottom, Virginia on the 16th of August in 1864.
He was shot just above the knee would be here, and his limb was amputated the following day on the 17th of August. He lived for 6 years with this femur becoming infected. You can see the change that's occurred. Let me show you a normal femur for comparison. And you can see the amount of infection that is set in on this bone.
Later, Fabre required more extensive surgery as the infection spread toward his hip. For archival purposes, the museum routinely photographed amputees alongside their severed limbs. The first extensive medical encyclopedia on military casualties was made possible by these Civil War survivors. But it would take another major war before scientists could begin to put names to soldiers who had died. December 7th, 1941. In the pre-dawn light, Japanese bombers appear out of nowhere. Sirens shriek, bombs explode. Pearl Harbor is destroyed. America is at war. Ironically, a war that took millions of lives would become the greatest boon to the fledgling science of forensic anthropology. World War II was the first war for which our service members had documented health records. By matching skeletal remains against known medical information, scientists were able to gather enough anatomical statistics to understand the life history each of us has written in our bones.
During World War II and Korea, we had the first opportunity as a scientist to really look at some good documented modern samples and develop some new techniques for determining stature and age on these men that were killed during the war. Since we knew who they were positively identified, we could measure the length of a femur or a long bone and plug that into the stature regression formula or make new stature regression formula from that.
Now, with a simple wooden board and a set of mathematical equations, anthropologists could begin to piece together profiles of the dead.
This bone is 323 millimeters long, and if we plug that into our stature formula, our regression formula for stature, we know this is a white male. We come up with an estimate of about 67.5 inches, plus or minus an inch on either side. That would be the stature estimate for this individual.
But there are nearly 90,000 Americans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam whose whereabouts are still unknown. Some of their remains have been recovered but not yet named. Other soldiers exist only as charred and shattered fragments hidden in remote jungles. But these men and women are far from forgotten. The search for their identity is one of the great detective stories in forensic science. More than 2.5 million Americans served in the Vietnam War, the longest war in American history. 58,000 died at an average age of 19. Boys barely out of high school. The ferocious guerrilla combat mangled and mutilated bodies, often beyond recognition. The remains of over 2,100 of these young men never made it back to the United States. Many of the men were buried upon impact at crash sites in the jungles, or their bones lay undiscovered in the foliage, decomposing from the intense, moist, tropical heat. After nearly 20 years in the military, 38-year-old Air Force Major Edward M. Hudgens was preparing to retire when he was sent to Southeast Asia in 1969. At home in Big Spring, Texas, he left behind his wife Mary and their 4 children, Stacy, Wendy, Jeff, and Doug. On March 21st, 1970, 7 months into his tour, Major Hudgens was leading a search and rescue mission flying over Laos when his A-1 aircraft was hit by intense enemy fire. Other pilots saw his plane go into an inverted spin and crash, but they saw no parachute and heard no emergency beeper signals.
There was never any uncertainty as to my husband's death. The uncertainty was not knowing when they were going to bring him back. All we could do was wait and wait for the government to get permission to go in. they were supposed to go into the site one time about 2 years ago, and we were all excited about it, and then there was a change in plans and they could not go in, and I was absolutely devastated. It just tore me apart, and I didn't realize how much I had counted on that.
Mary Hudgens has never remarried. Using her VA benefits, she went back to school, got a job, and raised her 4 children alone.
When other kids my age have lost a parent, they have a cemetery and a grave site they can go to, and they can commune with their parent, their lost one. We didn't have that.
Hope for the Hudgens family lies thousands of miles away, where scientists they had never met worked to find Ed Hudgens and bring him home. Hawaii's National Cemetery is known as the Punch Bowl. The stairs are flanked by stone walls etched with the names of thousands of soldiers who disappeared in combat, beginning with the Second World War. Nearby at Hickam Air Force Base, the U.S. Army's Central Identification Laboratory, Hawaii, SEALHI for short, is one of the world's leading institutions in forensic science. The soldiers and civilians who work here have pledged that the unaccounted for are not to be forgotten. Currently, over 78,000 men and women are missing or unaccounted for from World War II, 8,100 from Korea, and 2,154 from the Vietnam War. Deputy Commander of SEALHI is retired Colonel Johnny Webb.
Okay, as we prepare to go out to sites to recover service members lost in previous wars, a lot of work has to be accomplished before the teams can actually go out and begin the recovery operations.
Plain metal shelves hold thousands of files. In each folder are the medical and dental records of soldiers missing from the Vietnam War. Today, much of the information has been transferred into a massive computer database.
The real research is done in this room to prepare our teams to go out and do the excavations, as well as to provide the information to the scientific staff to make the individual identifications.
Before SEALHI sends an excavation team into the field, they study the reports from the casualty data section for each missing soldier. They then research any information gathered from outside sources. Eyewitness reports from local villagers who may have found a plane crash or people conducting oil or timber exploration can prove invaluable in pinpointing the exact location where a soldier was last seen. SEALHI recovery teams train in Hawaii before excavations begin abroad. A mock demonstration site simulates an A6 series aircraft crash with meticulous detail.
Here we have a lot of pin flags, different colors, yellow designating wreckage, red designating unexploded ordnance or bombs, and the blue is designating any life support material, things that the pilot was wearing at the time of the incident.
A 12 by 16 meter area is laid out in 4 by 4 meter units, so the team can document where each artifact is found. Dirt is carefully removed and brought to a sifting station, where it is sorted by hand through a fine mesh screen. the smallest fragment might make the difference in finding a soldier's name. The team is looking for anything that can be identified, either from the aircraft or personnel. Bones, ID tags, or pieces of a life support system.
It's pretty badly corroded.
Metal detectors scour the site in hopes of finding scraps from the plane. In the field, the detectors are vitally important, as they also help locate any live ammunition still on the site.
Mostly coral, just this band of red.
Ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves into the Earth which reflect off buried objects.
Disturbance close to the surface. The surface profile has been disturbed recently. Okay, we have an anomaly. We have metal object.
Different types of materials create colored bands, which helps the team assess the likelihood of a burial.
The first dramatic use is that when we go to Southeast Asia and we have these witnesses to incidents that occurred in the 60s, these people are apt to be old. And what they do, they say, well, yes, I did bury him, I did bury the American, and I buried him somewhere around here, but it's changed. And then they might point to an area, it's a football field in size, you know? Maybe the body's there, maybe it isn't. But I can eliminate vast areas of it within minutes.
After weeks and months of training, men and technology are put to the test in a once forbidden land. The jungles of Vietnam that claimed its victims more than 2 decades ago. The Army's Central Identification Laboratory sends teams all over the world to find the remains of service members who are missing or unaccounted for. Working in some of the world's most remote locations, the teams work tirelessly to ensure that they recover every piece of evidence. But 2 decades after the Vietnam War, crash sites are far from intact. Villagers have scavenged whatever they could find a use for. This piece of wreckage from a downed American airplane is being used as a blade for a plow. And now that plow may be hundreds of miles from where the plane actually went down. Seal High teams work closely with local villagers who might remember the crash or may have discovered some wreckage. The goal, to try to pinpoint the exact location of the crash.
She said she saw 13 people. She personally counted 13 people that morning.
The team compares the information they receive from the villagers with detailed maps prepared at Seal High to determine the coordinates of the probable crash site. Global positioning systems fix their exact position as they trek sometimes for miles toward the site.
Right dead on it, right in the middle of it.
Once the excavation is set up, work begins to find and clear the area of any ammunition. The work requires patience and precision and can be extremely dangerous.
Beauty! Okay, move on back. All right, I got it.
Live 40mm shells litter this C-130 crash site. Once they are located, they have to be carefully removed and carried to a safe distance where they will be disposed of later. Clues at the crash site come in different shapes and sizes. When a plane crashes, artifacts and remains bear the unmistakable scars of the 600-mile-per-hour impact. Large guns are buried by the force of the crash. The plane is literally torn apart. Pieces of the fuselage are scattered in all directions.
It's a helmet. helmet, microphone assembly rack, off the flyer's helmet.
Deep in the jungle, another Seal High scouting team uncovers a button from a flight suit. Then, further digging reveals a remnant of fabric from the suit beneath the dense jungle foliage. In a high-tech war, soldiers are mangled by their machines. Finding an intact skeleton in Vietnam would be inconceivable. So every fragment is a vital clue. The most significant finds are human bones and teeth. All the remains found in Vietnam are brought back to the Seal High Laboratory in Hawaii for analysis. Sometimes, all the forensic scientists have to work with are mere fragments. From these, they must piece together whether they are human, and if so, the individual's age, race, height, weight, and ultimately, their name. To date, Seal High has positively identified 570 unaccounted-for service members from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and returned the remains to their families. Often, bones arrive with no clear idea of where they came from. Identifying those remains is Seal High's most difficult task. Many times, several portions of a skeleton arrive at Seal High, each reported to be the remains of the same missing serviceman. Seal High anthropologists must try to identify each fragment of bone and determine who it belonged to. When bones cannot be identified by the standard methods, Seal High turns to DNA testing to analyze the remains. But the test won't work on small bone samples.
I will tell you that this is the only bone fragment on the table that is large enough and in a good enough state of preservation, we think, to yield DNA.
Before the bone can be tested, a sample must be cut and measured. Mitochondrial DNA will be extracted from the bone sample and compared to that of a living maternal relative.
Okay. What do you think, 5 grams?
5 grams.
We're going to send this sample to AFDL, and in about 4 weeks, they should issue a report to us on whether or not they were able to sequence mitochondrial DNA out of this sample.
Before any work begins at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory outside Washington, D.C., the bone sample must be cataloged and photographed. In the laboratory, before the process of extracting its DNA can begin, the exterior surface of the bone sample is cleaned to remove any contaminants. Then, a 2-gram fragment is washed, dried, and pulverized in a blender. The powder then undergoes a chemical reaction that disrupts the cells and releases the DNA into a liquid solution. This incubates overnight with an enzyme which breaks up the proteins within the cells, leaving purified DNA. Mitch Holland is the branch chief of service and genetics systems.
DNA fingerprinting is just like a fingerprint. What we do is we look along the sequence of the DNA, we analyze those regions, we compare those regions to, say, a suspect, a family member. When we do that comparison, we're looking for inclusions and exclusions. We're looking for matches and non-matches.
Scientists at the Armed Forces Lab have a twofold job: to identify DNA fingerprints from blood samples, and the more complicated task of extracting DNA from remains which may be decades old. In order to match the DNA fingerprint of a missing soldier, the scientists must test it against a blood sample which has been mailed to the Institute by a maternal relative. The process of extracting DNA from old skeletal remains is such a significant advance in biological science that in 1993, one of its creators, Dr. Kary Mullis, earned a Nobel Prize. Scientists had known of DNA since the 19th century, but the mysterious nucleic acid structure was not known until the 20th century. In 1962, James Watson and Francis Crick won the Nobel Prize for uncovering DNA's three-dimensional molecular structure. There are two types of DNA: nuclear DNA, which is found only in the cell's nucleus, and mitochondrial DNA, found in the surrounding mitochondria. The first type is not as plentiful as the second, which can endure in bones for thousands of years after death. In both varieties, DNA resembles a twisting ladder with cross rungs composed of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, or A, T, G, and C for short. The prints in DNA fingerprinting are pieces of A, T, G, and C of varying lengths and arrangements. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother. Therefore, people related along maternal lines share identical patterns in their A's, C's, G's, and T's that non-related people probably would not. A match indicates a high probability of identification, but in and of itself is not 100% conclusive. To have a large enough sample to work with, scientists are able to reproduce or copy the DNA in a machine called a thermocycler, which synthesizes millions of exact copies of the DNA within a few hours. The process is known as a polymerase chain reaction. The sample is then carefully loaded onto a gel through which an electric current is passed. Ultraviolet light helps visualize the individual bars of DNA. Then, several samples are loaded onto what is known as a sequencing gel, one sample per lane. The sample is then read by a laser, which runs back and forth across it several hundred times a minute. The information is then converted into a peak, which can be translated into an A, G, T, or C. When compared to the family reference sample, if the sequences are identical, they are considered a probable match. Over the years, remains alleged to be those of Ed Hudgens came to Seal High 4 times. Once from an unknown source, once from a Laotian native, and twice from his known crash site. The bone tested for DNA was from the Laotian source and was clearly ruled out by the lab tests. But some of the bones acquired from the unknown source aligned with fragments from the crash site. These can be certified as belonging to Hudgens. Artifacts at the site found near Ed's remains included his watch, a buckle from his seat harness, a dog tag chain, and a dime. An American coin deep in a faraway jungle. But it would be a single tooth, not much bigger than the dime he carried in his pocket, which provided the pivotal clue the scientists sought.
Oh, that looks pretty good.
When the cases come into the Seal High laboratory, if there are dental remains, they are studied by forensic odontologists. They look for any unique characteristics which would help match the tooth to a missing soldier.
In this tooth, we see a root canal. In other words, the tooth had the insides removed and was filled with paste. And that matches very closely with what we see in the postmortem x-rays. Other fillings that are easy to match are these single fillings on the lower teeth, here and here, as well as this series of fillings on the upper teeth. And so this is a good example of when we have enough evidence to work with, both ante-mortem and post-mortem, about how closely we can match the dental records.
Teeth are x-rayed and the information is directly input into a huge database of dental records.
This represents the post-mortem image that we just took on the tooth.
All the dental records of people missing from Southeast Asia and Korea are kept on file. The forensic odontologist enters the specific details of the tooth that has been found into the computer and begins to make a match by checking the tooth against the information in the records.
This patient had fillings on a couple of teeth in the top right side.
The computer checks the characteristics of this single tooth against the thousands of records in its memory. Each time it eliminates a record, it moves closer to finding a match. The forensic odontologist enters more information, and the computer eliminates all but 4 records. This tooth could belong to one of 4 missing men. One more piece of information remains. This molar had a small filling in the bottom right quadrant. This information eliminates all the records but one. The team has made a match.
Can you take this down to casualty data and tell them that we have a pretty good hit on Capme, and I'd like to take a look at the record?
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Only a few hundred bone fragments, most less than ½ an inch in size, and one tooth can be said with certainty to belong to Ed Hudgens. For the family, it is enough. Whether transporting tiny, unidentified bone fragments from an excavation site to a lab in Hawaii, or finally sending a soldier with a name home to his loved ones, Seal High treats all remains with utmost respect.
Forward! Hurt!
At Arlington National Cemetery, the ritual is repeated every hour, 365 days of the year. Fallen heroes forever honored, yet forever unnamed and unknown. But one hero, once among the missing, has finally been found. He comes to eternal rest with a name, full military honors, and a Purple Heart. For Mary Hudgens and her children, Ed Hudgens' journey cannot be measured in years nor calculated in miles.
He lay in a jungle for 26 years, and we now have put him to rest and with honors, and his fellow countrymen have honored him, and it brings it to a conclusion for us.
"26 years to the day after Ed Hudgens' plane crashed in the jungles of Southeast Asia, his children lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns. Dozens of scientists around the world have worked toward this day. Piece by piece, clue by clue, they have unraveled a mystery that tormented a family for more than a quarter century. The final chapter in this soldier's story has been written. A family is reunited. An incomplete circle is, at long last, closed. Ed Hudgens has come home.
A car bomb hurls investigators down a dark and twisted path. At the end is one woman with many deadly secrets. A bustling emergency room is brought to its knees with the arrival of a dying woman. Scientists try to determine what might have turned her blood to toxic gas. A Florida family is mysteriously sickened. The mother suffers a lingering death. Before police can catch the killer, they must first find the source of the poison. The most subtle of killers is absolutely silent, working from the inside out to turn its victim's body against itself. When chemistry goes wrong, Scientists struggle to determine what constitutes a lethal dosage. June 28, 1983, began as a night of celebration. Judy Bueno Año met her boyfriend, John Gentry, and the women who worked at her beauty salon at a Pensacola, Florida restaurant. They gathered to present one of the employees with a pendant in honor of her birthday. As the dinner was finished and the party wore down, Judy suggested that John go to the liquor store for some champagne so they could continue celebrating elsewhere. As night fell, the streets grew quiet. But the silence would be shattered in an instant. Police and rescue raced to the scene. Gentry was rushed to the hospital, shrapnel embedded in his back. At first, investigators weren't sure if the explosion was due to mechanical failure or an attempt on Gentry's life. But even a cursory look at the crime scene revealed the blast to be no accident. It came from the trunk, an unlikely place for an explosion of that magnitude. Because bombings are a federal offense, Pensacola police notified the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. By the extent of the blast, ATF agents estimated 2 sticks of dynamite were used, rigged to the taillights by yellow and orange wire. Gentry was lucky to have escaped with his life. As the ATF investigated the scene and the crime photos, Pensacola police sought to find out who would benefit from Gentry's death. That task fell to Detective Ted Chamberlain.
What we usually do is we look into an insurance policies of the victim, and that's what we did with Gentry. And we looked into and we found he did have a large insurance policy on him.
The beneficiary was Judy Bueno Año, Gentry's girlfriend. But that wasn't surprising. The two were starting a business together. By itself, the information meant nothing. Chamberlain needed more to go on. The ATF found it. They traced the dynamite to a man in Alabama, a very close friend of Judy Bueno Año. By now, Gentry was out of intensive care. Detectives took the opportunity to talk to him about what happened, to let him know that Judy Bueno Año was the main suspect. Gentry found it difficult to believe, but then he began thinking about it.
He said, you know, when I'm staying over there at Judy's house, she was giving me these pills, vitamins to make me feel better. And he said, and I kept getting sick. He said, so I quit taking them, and then I felt better. He said, and I took them again and got sick again.
Gentry had been so ill, he'd spent time in the hospital. There, he recovered completely, though his doctor wasn't sure what was wrong with him. Once Gentry returned home, he relapsed. Finally, he stopped taking the vitamin pills, and his health returned. He felt his days of illness were behind him. And then his car blew up. Sensing a connection, the detective asked Gentry if he'd saved any of the capsules.
Do you have a business partner?
As a matter of fact, he had. They were supposedly a popular vitamin C supplement. Chamberlain sent them to the lab for analysis. Finding out what something isn't is easier than finding out what it is. The process of elimination began with a comparison of the capsules with vitamin C. It proved there was not a speck of the vitamin in the capsules. That discovery alone ramped up the suspicion that the pills were poisoned. But what was in them? The substance in the capsules was dissolved and tested. Some tests analyzed its chemical makeup, others measured the wavelengths of light it absorbed. By comparing these results with a database of chemicals, the compound was identified. The capsules were found to contain a substance called paraformaldehyde. It has no known medical use. In fact, it's considered a Class 3 poison, which means it's moderately toxic. John Trestrail of the Blodgett Poison Control Center is a poisoning expert. According to him, if murder was the motive, paraformaldehyde wasn't the best choice.
When it breaks down to formaldehyde, which we know is used to preserve bodies, is very irritating. It wouldn't be a very good poison to pick for homicidal reasons. It'd be more irritating, irritating to the eyes, irritating to the respiratory tract. And I suppose in chronic exposures, we know formaldehyde can cause cancer.
Gentry's story, bolstered by the tampered pills and the explosion, gave Chamberlain ample grounds to obtain search warrants for Bueno Año's home and beauty salon. At her house, they found more vitamin capsules.
Coming right up.
Okay.
I'll check the closet.
Yeah, I had something like that when I was a kid.
Basket. Oh, I got something.
In her son's closet, they found wire that resembled the wire used to blow up the car.
Look at this. What you got? Got a wire here. Gloves.
So we sent that off to the lab, and they sent us back pictures of the wire and the color coding and striations of the wire. One taken from the piece of the bomb that was gone, and the one from the boy's room, and you put them together, it was just like matching up ballistics on bullets. I mean, they looked exactly alike, and that was real good evidence.
Hi, I'm Detective Robert Beasley. This is an investigation.
While one group of officers searched the house, another group was at work collecting chemicals from Bueno Año's salon.
I'm not sure either, but let's back.
For Judy Bueno Año, paraformaldehyde would be a poison of opportunity.
Just be careful with it. Don't.
The chemical is used in beauty salons as a disinfectant. With evidence of the bomb and the poison, police had ample grounds to arrest her on suspicion. The bombing made her a suspect in a federal crime. The ATF's jurisdiction stretched beyond Florida to all 50 states. Having failed at both poisoning and blowing up her lover, Bueno Año seemed like a two-time loser. But as investigators checked her background, they began to suspect that she may have just been in a slump. As news of Judy Bueno Año's arrest spread, Detective Chamberlain received a call from the mother of one of her ex-boyfriends in Alabama, a man named Bobby Joe Morris, a man who had died mysteriously.
Her son and Judy lived together, and she had a very strong suspicion that he didn't die of natural causes, that she had poisoned or killed her son.
Bueno Año had pressured Bobby Joe's mother to cremate the body, but she refused. Chamberlain promised he'd look into the matter.
Everybody that we talked to, they all seemed to be a little bit scared of Judy, a little bit afraid of her, that she would always make up these incredible stories is what we were hearing from her. And we even talked to one witness that the witness said that Judy had told this girl, said, look, if you don't like your husband, poison him.
With stories of Bobby Joe Morris and others coming to light, police began to suspect that John Gentry wasn't Bueno Año's first victim. They found that her life, at least on the surface, appeared touched by tragedy. But a closer inspection suggested something more diabolical. Judy lost her husband, James Goodyear, in 1971, 3 months after he returned from Vietnam, he lapsed into delirium and died.
What a great day for a stakeout.
After his death, Judy changed her name from Judy Goodyear to Judy Bueno Año, the Spanish translation of her husband's surname. The deeper Chamberlain dug, the darker Judy's past became. Bodies were beginning to tumble out of her closet.
You'd open up one door and go in, and it would lead to about 5 or 6 more doors. That was the problem with her. You know, it didn't look like it was ever going to stop. You know, we kept finding bodies everywhere.
One of those bodies was her own son, Michael Goodyear. He joined the Army in 1979. Shortly after visiting his mother while on leave, he became ill. Tests showed exposure to arsenic. Because his job involved working with the substance, it was assumed that he'd inadvertently ingested some. He soon began to lose the use of his arms and legs, and he was discharged. His first day home, Judy and her youngest son took Michael on a canoe trip near their home. Despite the fact that Michael wore heavy braces, he had no life jacket. In the middle of the lake, the boat capsized and Michael drowned. Back then, it seemed like a tragic, if stupid, accident. But now, Chamberlain wasn't so certain. Too many men in Judy Bueno Año's life had come to an untimely end. A sinister pattern was taking shape. While Judy awaited her day in court for the attempted murder of John Gentry, Chamberlain gathered evidence of homicide she may have gotten away with, at least so far. He learned that Judy's husband, James Goodyear, showed symptoms consistent with any number of illnesses, among them arsenic poisoning. If he was poisoned, the evidence was buried with him. 12 years after his death, his body was ordered exhumed to look for proof.
And when you exhume a body looking for one of the heavy metals like lead, thallium, arsenic, antimony, these are all elements. Elements have been around since the solar system was created. They're just as detectable today as they were 250 million years ago and 250 million years down the road from now. So when you talk about digging up a body looking for arsenic, if it was in that body when it went in the ground, it's going to be in that body until it disintegrates.
Goodyear had been autopsied at the time of his death, but the medical examiner wasn't looking for poison, so he didn't find any. Almost anything can be poisonous if enough is swallowed, so no single test can be used to detect all poisons. The analyst must be guided by his knowledge of the symptoms so he can narrow the field and test for specific poisons. Arsenic tends to concentrate in the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys. Samples of each were tested for the toxin. Arsenic can take down a person in an hour or a year, depending on how much he ingests. A single large dose kills quicker than small doses over a longer time. A faster death means the poison would have less time to damage organs. Goodyear's lingering death suggested cumulative long-term poisoning. The ravaged condition of his organs bore that out. The diagnosis was crucial and incriminating because it made accidental poisoning less likely. Since James and Judy Goodyear lived in the same house, it seemed reasonable that they'd both be exposed to arsenic if the hazard were present. But Judy never showed any symptoms. Next, the medical examiner set out to determine how much arsenic was present in Goodyear's system. The victim's hair and nails provided a handy yardstick. A complete fingernail was removed from the nail bed and dissolved in acid. The resulting solution was put in an instrument called an atomic absorption spectrometer that determines the concentration of arsenic in the sample. The amount of arsenic a person swallows is proportional to the amount in the victim's hair and nails. The medical examiner could tell that the levels were too high to have come from the environment. And since hair grows at a set rate, he could use it to see how long Goodyear had been given the poison. He determined that the contaminated portion of the hair was consistent with 3 months' growth. James Goodyear had been home from the Navy 3 months before he died. The evidence suggested that Judy had wasted no time doing away with her husband. Shortly after James Goodyear's autopsy, Judy's boyfriend and second suspected victim, Bobby Joe Morris, was exhumed. His hair and nails contained enough arsenic to kill 11 men. It appeared that over a 12-year period, Judy Bueno Año managed to fatally poison 2 men and poison and drown a third. Other men in her life had also met mysterious ends, but she was never prosecuted for their deaths. The motive in every case was insurance money. Ironically, it was the one who got away, John Gentry, that ultimately exposed her deadly game. Her botched attempt to poison him forced her to resort to using a bomb. On the surface, the choice may seem bizarre, but to poison expert John Trestrail, the difference between bombs and poisons is only a matter of degree.
I personally believe there's a great similarity between the psychological profile of a bomber and a poisoner. Because what is a poison other than a chemical bomb? It doesn't make any noise. The effect is the same. You blow up the victim.
Poisoning is more subtle and may at first go undetected. But there's no statute of limitations on murder, and poison leaves its traces for a very long time. One clue is all it takes to expose the truth.
And of course, every poisoner looks for the perfect poison that's undetectable. And my answer is, what would you call it? If it's got a name, don't you have to see something to name it? And if you see it, is it not detectable? So there is no perfect, non-detectable poison.
Judy Bueno Año received 12 years for bombing Gentry's car, life in prison for the drowning death of her son, and is on death row for poisoning her husband. For the death of Bobby Joe Morris, there was simply no punishment left to give her. She is one of only 48 women ever sentenced to death in the United States. It took years for Bueno Año's methodical poisonings to catch up with her, but once her villainy was revealed, the evidence was irrefutable. Across the country, scientists faced a more perplexing dilemma. How could the body of a dying woman poison the staff of an emergency room? Just after 8 p.m. on February 9, 1994, paramedics whisked 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez into the emergency room at California's Riverside Hospital. Her boyfriend called because she collapsed and had trouble breathing. The paramedics related to the ER staff that the patient had cervical cancer, but she hadn't yet begun chemotherapy. In fact, there was nothing in her record to prepare the ER for what was to come. When Ramirez arrived at the emergency room, she already had an oxygen mask on her face. Then her heart rhythm began to fluctuate, and the staff tried to shock it back to normal. It wasn't working. A nurse drew blood to run some tests. And that's when the well-choreographed chaos of the emergency room began to fall to pieces. Ramirez's body began to take on an oily sheen. The nurse drawing the blood complained of a strange odor. She handed the hypodermic to a physician. Then she passed out. The odor, something like garlic or ammonia, increased. Beige crystals were noticed in the blood sample. Suddenly, another nurse fell. In short order, another nurse became dizzy and went to the nurses' station to rest. There, she lost consciousness. Her arms and legs began to shake uncontrollably. Occasionally, she'd stop breathing. Then one of the doctors succumbed. Ramirez was still not stabilized. An emergency was declared as attendants rushed in to clear the collapsing staff and attend to Ramirez. As the emergency room was evacuated, gurneys were wheeled into the parking lot. Unable to cope with the bizarre onslaught, Riverside sent its staff and patients to other hospitals. The caregivers suddenly became the patients. Bedlam ruled, and at its center lay a helpless, dying woman. Within 15 minutes of contact with Gloria Ramirez, 27 of the 37 staff members at Riverside Hospital suffered strange symptoms. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch was one of them.
After I awoke, outside was very sick. Uncontrollable tremors, nausea, retching, difficulty breathing. My vision felt kind of limited at that time. I could only see things close to me.
There was simply no explaining what could have caused the symptoms. Many of those affected recovered quickly. Others spent weeks in the hospital. Within 35 minutes of Ramirez's arrival at the hospital, she was pronounced dead. The crisis had passed, but the mystery deepened.
35.
Her body was sealed in 2 plastic bags and an airtight casket before being moved to the hospital morgue. To find the cause of the catastrophe, the Riverside Hazardous Materials, or HAZMAT team, arrived suited for battle. Ductwork, sewage lines, plumbing, and waste disposal were thoroughly checked. The air in the emergency room was electronically sniffed for toxic gases, solvents, or chemicals. Nothing was overlooked, and nothing could explain what happened. Once the emergency room was given a clean bill of health, suspicions turned to the patient. An autopsy revealed nothing extraordinary. Gloria Ramirez died of kidney failure as a result of her cancer. Dissatisfied with the findings and desperate for an explanation, hospital officials sent blood and tissue samples from Ramirez to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, 60 miles east of San Francisco. Solvents were added to Ramirez's blood sample. Organic chemicals in the blood were dissolved, leaving water and blood cells behind. The result is a highly concentrated extract of the chemicals in the blood. Brian Andresen is the director of the center.
Here in our laboratory are very precise analytical tools that allow us to look at every chemical that we extracted from the blood sample and actually determine the chemical structure and even get concentrations, all down at ultra low concentrations.
Identifying the chemicals took a 2-pronged approach. First, the extract of Ramirez's blood was heated in a gas chromatograph until it vaporized. Because every chemical vaporizes at a different rate, the components separated. The spectrometer then identified each chemical by reading the patterns of light they emitted. The results were then plotted on a computer in the form of peaks and valleys. What would Ramirez's blood reveal?
Every peak here is a different, unique chemical that was in the blood of Mrs. Ramirez. And things stand out, it's very obvious. This is all Tylenol or acetaminophen is right here. Cholesterol is here, other drugs, and a very unusual chemical that we initially discovered, which was right here. We don't know what it is at this moment, but luckily we have libraries that when you actually search a library, in the computer it will print out what this chemical is.
It turned out to be a high concentration of a chemical called dimethylsulfone, or DMSO2. It comes from the breakdown of another chemical, DMSO, or dimethyl sulfoxide. Though it's manufactured as an industrial lubricant, DMSO is used by thousands of athletes and arthritis sufferers to relieve pain. It's conceivable that Ramirez was using it for this purpose. But its waste product, DMSO2, is not toxic, even in the high concentrations found in her tissues. Its presence did nothing to explain why the emergency room was brought to its knees. From his findings, Andresen had to conclude he'd found nothing to account for the harrowing events on the night Ramirez died. Without any physical explanation for what was now being called the Ramirez incident, the California Department of Health Services wrote it off to mass hysteria due to stress. The healthcare workers were not buying it.
My response to the claim of mass hysteria was not something that I can entertain personally, because the people involved in emergency care, and in particular this emergency room, were all like a well-oiled machine. They'd all had tons of experience, 15 or years better, veterans of all types of occurrences, and this was just something else that they had to take care of. And you can't argue with that. I mean, these people are not generally hysterical.
Unwilling to accept the ruling of the health department, Welch did some homework of her own. She knew that many of her colleagues, and she herself, had suffered long-term health problems, not the sort of symptoms induced by mass hysteria. She gathered up lab reports, medical records, and contacted Brian Andresen. Andresen and his colleague, Deputy Director Patrick Grant, looked over the data Welch sent them. They focused on the one compound that didn't seem to fit.
Basically, I came back into my office and started looking up compounds in the Chemist's Bible, the Merck Index. Looked up dimethyl sulfoxide and dimethyl sulfone, and fortunately, they're right there together in language even a nuclear chemist can understand. And at that point, I realized that oxidation was the connector between the two.
If Ramirez was taking DMSO on her own to relieve her pain, it seemed plausible the extra oxygen she was given on the way to the hospital could have sped the chemical's transformation to its waste product, DMSO2. DMSO is oily and has a garlicky smell. That could explain the sheen on Ramirez's skin and the odor in the emergency room. But it didn't explain why so many people were sickened. Pat Grant began to formulate a theory. On the same page in the drug manual as DMSO and DMSO2 was an entry for DMSO4. The only difference between the two compounds was more oxygen. But it was a crucial difference. DMSO2 is a harmless vapor. DMSO4 is a deadly nerve gas.
And if you read the toxicities and the various symptoms that people that are exposed to dimethyl sulfate experience, it was quite similar to the Riverside incident.
Grant's theory sounded good on paper, but no one had ever turned harmless DMSO2 into deadly DMSO4 in the lab by simply adding more oxygen. If Grant was asserting that a dying woman could somehow change into a canister of nerve gas, he was going to have to prove it. The scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory had a daunting task ahead of them. To see if DMSO2 could turn into its deadly cousin, DMSO4, in the emergency room, they had to replicate the conditions during the last few minutes of Gloria Ramirez's life. The work was assigned to analytical chemist Rich Whipple. The first obstacle was the nature of the two substances. While harmless DMSO2 dissolves in blood, deadly DMSO4 doesn't. So how could the compound be in Ramirez's veins? The answer is, it couldn't.
Our belief is that she had DMSO2 in the blood, and then when it was withdrawn from her system, it was then converted to DMSO4.
The chemical event, if it happened at all, happened in the syringe. Using a substitute for human blood, Whipple performed an experiment to show how a change in temperature could change the form of the chemical. At body temperature, DMSO2 stays dissolved in the solution. But cooled to room temperature, it forms crystals. Crystals like the ones witnessed by some of the emergency room staff. In her body, Ramirez's blood was 98.6 degrees, but the portion drawn into the syringe was immediately cooled to around 64 degrees, the temperature of the emergency room. The drastic temperature change may have caused the DMSO2 crystals to separate out. Everything about the theory seemed to be holding together except one crucial point. Whipple didn't manage to produce any detectable DMSO4. But lab tests can never perfectly replicate a real-life situation. In the emergency room, only the slightest amount of DMSO4 would have been needed to sicken all those staffers. 1/10 of a gram of the substance can be lethal. In smaller doses, DMSO4 can cause long-term nerve damage and other lingering health problems. A year or more after the Ramirez incident, some of the staffers in the emergency room still had symptoms. Grant believes this is further evidence in favor of a chemical explanation, not mass hysteria or some other psychological cause.
In comparison to the other theories that were out there before we proposed our chemical theory, I would believe it over mass hysteria of an experienced emergency room staff.
Though Grant's findings are generally accepted, many scientists await further proof before they're convinced. Until the mechanism for the deadly transformation is fully understood, there remains a slim chance that the Ramirez incident could happen again. The events in Riverside's emergency room highlight how toxic hazards can come from the least likely sources. That's a fact poisoners use to their advantage. Since anything can be a poison, the killer can hide his weapon in plain sight. At 7 a.m., October 23, 1988, Peggy Carr arrived at a restaurant in Alturas, Florida, where she worked as a waitress. As she waited for her shift to start, she began to feel ill. Soon, her legs started to burn, and pain racked her chest. She thought she was having a heart attack. One of the regulars, a former Army medic, checked her pulse and reassured her that whatever was ailing her, it wasn't her heart. But the pain continued to grow. Peggy was sent home to rest. The pain was unrelenting, and Peggy's family sent her to the hospital. She was admitted and placed under observation. 16 hours after her first symptoms, Peggy Carr was practically incapacitated, and her position was stumped. 3 days and a battery of tests later, doctors were no closer to making a diagnosis. Then, just as mysteriously as they had begun, Peggy's symptoms began to fade. She was sent home.
And my chest is real tight.
But within a week, the crushing pain gripped her again. She was rushed back to the hospital. Besides the intense pain in her limbs and joints, her hair began to fall out, and she was becoming unable to move.
Good.
Tests still showed nothing wrong with her.
Lymph nodes. Okay.
Doctors thought some virus had nestled in her nervous system. She told her neurologist that she felt like she was walking on hot coals. The description brought to mind something he'd only read about.
Now, do you know?
He decided to try one more test for thallium poisoning. Thallium is a natural element found in trace amounts in soil and water. Its purified form is strictly regulated. Up until 1972, when it was banned in the United States, it was used in rat and ant poisons. Tests showed that Peggy Carr's system had 20,000 times the amount of thallium one might expect to find. The poison was eating away her nervous system. There was no cure. At first, Peggy's poisoning was considered accidental.
The girls from church.
Tests on her family revealed that everyone in the Carr household had traces of it.
Oh, we can't decide.
The Polk County Sheriff's Department and the Health Department combed the Carr's house to find the source of the contaminant. Detective Ernie Mincy led the investigation.
Our sole purpose was to identify that poison and have it removed from the environment to prevent further injury to any of the persons.
Over the next month, investigators collected food, water, and soil samples in the Carr's home and neighborhood. Everything was sent to the lab to be tested. After an impatient wait, every test came back negative. Investigators were desperate to find the source of the poison. Meanwhile, Peggy could no longer breathe on her own and lapsed into a coma. The search for the poison continued.
Can I have some more bags,
How many
please?
others would be sickened before it was found? Among the items collected from the Carr's house were returnable bottles of Coca-Cola. One of them was broken.
Things like this before?
All had residue on the bottom. Like everything else, they were sent off for analysis. The bottles joined the ranks of dozens of items collected from the Carr's house. Each had been subjected to the same test. Each had been eliminated. Investigators hoped to have better luck with the bottles. To test for thallium, the residue was dissolved in nitric acid. A sample was placed in a graphite tube and vaporized. Then, a lamp with a thallium filament was shined into the tube. The test relies on the principle that every compound emits a specific wavelength of light. An instrument called a spectrophotometer measured the amount of light absorbed by the sample. It showed that the bottles contained more than 11 times the level of the toxin one might expect to find. Finally, the source of the poison had been found. But how did thallium get into the soft drink? Were others out there waiting to be consumed? Mincy feared a manufacturing catastrophe or malicious tampering. With the assistance of the FBI and the Coca-Cola Company, the lot numbers were traced back to the store, the warehouse, and the bottling plant. The search came up clean. No other bottles had been tainted, and there'd been no other reports of poisoning. The tainted bottles were specific to the Carr's home. But who would have done it? A poisoner must have intimate contact with his victim's surroundings in order to plant the toxin. That's why most poisonings are done within families.
That's up for grabs.
And that's why suspicion fell on Pye Carr.
Had a plan for at least 3 months.
Pye was Peggy's second husband. They'd been married only a few months when Peggy grew ill, but it seemed their honeymoon was long over.
When you bring it up,
Mincy learned that just prior to the poisoning, the Carrs had an argument that resulted in Peggy spending the night in a hotel. The weekend her symptoms first appeared, Pye was conveniently out of town on a hunting trip. When he returned, he'd resisted taking his wife to the hospital. Everything seemed to point to Pye Carr. But convictions aren't made on such circumstantial evidence. Mincy's criminal investigation had just begun. More evidence needed to be gathered. More leads followed.
It's in here somewhere, fellas.
Carr's every move was scrutinized. Almost as an afterthought, he presented a convenient clue in his own defense. He showed detectives a threatening note he claimed he received 2 weeks before the poisoning. The Carrs didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but Pye kept it just in case.
This note indicated that ever who had written it wanted the entire family to move out of the state of Florida or else they would die.
The note, along with the fact that Pye Carr had consumed some of the tainted soft drink, weakened the accusations against him. But he wasn't home free yet. He could have written the note himself and taken the poison intentionally to deflect the pall of guilt. Mincy kept his eye on Pye Carr while he sought other suspects. Who would want to kill the family? Mincy learned that the Carrs didn't get along with their neighbors, George Trepal and his wife Diana. Several weeks before the poisoning, Peggy and Diana almost came to blows over the Carrs' loud music. It hardly seemed like grounds for attempted murder. To find out more about the icy relationship between the neighbors, Mincy paid a visit to George Trepal. Trepal's reaction to the subject of the Carrs was unexpectedly harsh.
He had went into a tirade about the problems with these red-necked children and family that lived next door to him.
Their kids make all kinds of noise, play the radio real loud.
Then Mincy asked him why he thought anyone might want to harm the family.
He quoted the threatening letter the Carrs had received weeks before verbatim. He said exactly what was in the note. Nobody else knew of its existence, nobody else except law enforcement.
At that moment, George Trepal became the prime suspect. But Mincy had no more to go on with Trepal than he had with Pye Carr. So he began looking into Trepal's surprising past. Trepal was an eccentric man who enjoyed creating games and crafting scenarios. He also belonged to Mensa, an elite society of people whose IQs are among the top 2% in the world. He and his wife were trained chemists. What's more, the quirky genius had done time for masterminding one of the largest amphetamine manufacturing operations in the Southeast. Thallium is sometimes used to make amphetamines. According to John Trestrail, Trepal had the means and the mind to orchestrate a poisoning.
They can plan a script of a death. She'll be here and she'll be eating this and then she'll do this and I'll do this, and it's all laid out. So I think this takes a great deal of intelligence to plan this out. This is not a brute force weapon. This is mind, not muscle.
But what would his motive be? In his prison records, Mincy found a letter Trepal wrote complaining to officials about his fellow inmates' radios. As hard as it was to believe, loud music seemed to be an overwhelming sore point for him. On March 3rd, 1989, Peggy Carr died after lingering in a coma for 3 months. Mincy now had to prove that Trepal was a murderer. With nothing but the flimsiest circumstantial evidence, Mincy couldn't get a search warrant for Trepal's house. The only way to crack this case was to outsmart the certified genius. After several months of background checks on George Trepal, Detective Mincy was confident he poisoned Peggy Carr. All he needed was proof. But Trepal was too clever to leave clues out in the open. Mincy needed to get inside his house and get inside his head. To carry it off, he needed someone to befriend the alleged killer, win his confidence, and then betray it. For this deadly game, he counted on Special Agent Susan Gorick. She became Sherry Gwynn, a woman on the verge of divorce who counted on Trepal's shoulders to cry on. She met him at a party that he organized for Mensa members. Its theme was murder.
I learned a lot about his personality and about his habits, about his associates. One of the things that I learned was that he did have a large ego. I did use my personality of Sherry to play off of that ego and to get him to talk more. And I used that to my advantage.
The friendship blossomed slowly, forcing Gorick to maintain her Sherry Gwynn persona for a full year. All the while, she lived in fear that Trepal would see through her masquerade, putting her life in danger. Slowly, she gathered what evidence she could to build her case, hoping he'd tip his hand. As the months went by, she didn't have much.
I gained a multitude of small evidence, small statements that all put together was overwhelming. But if you looked at one small statement, it did not look like a lot of evidence.
Like playing an excruciating game of hangman, Gorick slowly drew her picture of Trepal as the murderer. But even after a year, she was still waiting to add that final stroke essential to win the game. Finally, in December 1989, Gorick got the break she needed. Trepal and his wife moved out of town and allowed Sherry Gwynn to rent their house. As a tenant, she could search the entire property without a warrant. She'd gotten all she could out of Trepal. Perhaps now his house would give up his secrets. She called in the Polk County Crime Scene Unit. They combed the premises, collecting whatever they could find. Believing Trepal would be too smart to have kept any thallium around his house, they looked for its telltale residue.
I truly believed that if we were going to find thallium, that it would probably be either in the air conditioning filter or possibly down one of the drains. And we spent a lot of time with the crime scene people swabbing the drains, trying to get any residue that he may have poured out.
While some investigators were in the house looking for trace evidence, others collected vials of chemicals from the garage. Everything was labeled and sent to the FBI for analysis. Months went by before the results came back.
I assumed because it took so long with the lab report that they didn't find anything.
But Gorick was wrong. When the reports came back, they showed that one of the vials, picked up from the workbench in Trepal's garage, contained thallium powder. For Gorick and Mincy, 15 months of deception paid off. The evidence to convict George Trepal of poisoning the cars was in hand. At Trepal's trial, it was clear that he was a killer without a conscience. Like the murder weekend party he organized, death was just a game to him.
George Trepal had absolutely no remorse for his actions. He justified it with his superior intelligence and the fact that people with lesser intelligence did not deserve to live on this planet.
Unlike most poisoners, Trepal's motive was neither love nor money. He wanted to kill his neighbors simply because he found them annoying. According to John Trestrail, the ego that led him to think so little of others ultimately led to his own demise.
The container containing the evidence was left in his home. Why would he do that? Here's a very intelligent man. Didn't he look down the road to say, I better get rid of this bottle? No, his ego said, they'll never get this far. They'll never figure out how this happened.
A jury found George Trepal guilty of 14 felony counts, including first-degree murder in the death of Peggy Carr. He was sentenced to death. As we go about our daily lives, most of us seldom think about the toxic world we live in. In the past, that lack of diligence provided the poisoner's greatest opportunity. But now, science is catching up. More than ever, unexplained deaths are viewed with suspicion, and in the lab, more of those suspicions are being justified.